Yeah, I think I will make a start. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And welcome to our monthly International Development and Innovation Seminar series of 2021-2022. This is our second event of the season, and we are really delighted to have with us today a representation of the REDEFINE project. So Giles Mohan, who's the Chair International Development and Principal Investigator of the project, will join us in a bit. And then we have two of the four postdoctoral researchers, Susan Chu and Samuel Rogers. Unfortunately, Florian Schaffer is off ill today, but I'm sure that both Susan and Samuel will cover both the broad overview of the project and also give us some insights of their individual research project. So I will briefly, give you a summary of the REDEFINE project, but then someone will explain a bit more. REDEFINE is a 2.5 million euro project funded by the European Research Council. It examines what China's rise means for how we understand global development and specifically Europe's place in it, in particular in the topic of and big theme of infrastructure. It adopts an interdisciplinary, comparative and ethnographic case studies in the UK, Germany, Greece and Hungary. And it will produce fine-grained analysis to understand the rationales for Chinese investment in Europe. It touches upon many issues such as financial streams, the structure of the project, and the interface of national, local, and global development. So without further ado, I will pass the floor. I will give the floor to Sam will go through the project and also give us a little bit of insight about the new entry that we have in the school, which are really proud of. So thank you. I will stop you, like both you and Susan will discuss. I will give you a hint when we have 45 minutes. We have passed 45 minutes. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much, Lorena, for that introduction. That was a very helpful way to start off our presentation this morning. So first of all, I will share my screen. How do I?
We can see your slides now.
Okay, just realised that these are the wrong ones. So this is what I wanted to do. And how do I do full screen? So this is my first time using Teams on this.
I think it's fine.
Yeah, okay.
We can see those fine,
Yeah.
Sam. Yeah,
okay.
yeah, that's fine.
Okay,
we can
great.
zoom from our end.
Because I have it like the list at the bottom, but hopefully it'll be okay.
Yeah, I don't see the list at the bottom. So.
Oh, okay, great. No, it's just for me. Well, no pandemic-induced presentation would be a presentation without some technical problems. So hopefully from now on things will go okay. So as Lorena said at the introduction, the point of this discussion this morning will be to kind of provide the audience with some more information of this project. So to do this, I will start using these slides. It will take up to 45 minutes, but may not take that long. And then Giles will join us at some point, just after midday, and then we'll open the floor to questions and answers. So the way that this, okay. So the general outline of the presentation this morning is going to just briefly discuss the composition of our team. I'm going to talk about the project overview and the goals of the project, moving on to methodology, data collection and project timeline, before looking at an example infrastructure project within that we will look at. Then we'll introduce the postdoctoral researchers. There are 3 of us currently at the moment, and then we'll finish up. So the REDEFINE team, as Lorena has already mentioned, the principal investigator is Giles Mohan, so I'm sure you have all met him. He's obviously been here for at Open for many years, and as I said, he will come back in to the meeting shortly. And then we have a couple of very excellent colleagues in the kind of admin department. So Natalie is the main kind of go-to person for us. We have 3 postdoctoral researchers. So there's myself, Susan, who will introduce herself shortly, and then Florian, as Lorena mentioned, unfortunately is ill today. We have also space for one more person who will join us, hopefully at the beginning of next year. We also have 2 research fellows with us. So Lorena is one of them, and she has been contributing to our project since some time, perhaps before that as well. And also Filippo, who joins us regularly as well. And finally, we have one current doctoral researcher, Olga, who joined about 6 weeks ago, who is co-supervised by Florian and Giles, and I think also Lorena, but I'm not sure about that. And then we have a second person who will join in February, who will be co-supervised by Giles and me. Okay, so moving on to the overview and project goals. I hope, by the way, you're enjoying the artistry of the slides. They're very good, I think. So the key aim, well, first of all, I'll tell you what it stands for. So REDEFINE stands for Reorienting Development, the Dynamics and Effects of Chinese Infrastructure Investment in Europe. And as Lorena already mentioned, this is funded through an advance grant through the European Research Council. The key aim of the project is to use insights from international development to interrogate Chinese engagement in the heart of Europe, and by doing so, force us to re-theorize the what, how, and where of development. In doing so, the project will reorient the Eurocentric debates in the social sciences around how we define and limit development, who drives these processes, and what this means for societies and communities affected by such investments. And then finally, REDEFINE will undertake fine-grained empirical analysis to understand the rationales for Chinese investment into Europe, the geopolitical dynamics surrounding these new financing streams, the structuring of specific projects, and the ways in which these investments interface with national and local development policy. The main kind of empirical goals of the project are principally fourfold. Basically, what we want to do is understand the rationale for Chinese investments in Europe. Obviously, since since 2013, the Belt and Road Initiative has really kind of acted as a springboard for lots of investments into Europe. But these capital inflows did not begin in 2013, of course. And also, it does not mean that all infrastructure investment projects are always realized. They always go smoothly, and they always kind of deliver what they plan to do from the outset. So there are many tensions and controversies surrounding them. And what we aim to do is try to understand those a little bit more. And then this, of course, kind of tips into the geopolitical dynamics of these new financing streams. So, for example, in a lot of media truths and half-truths talk about a kind of a pending kind of new Cold War between China and the United States. How far that is true or not is a slightly separate question, but nonetheless, these the infrastructure projects as financed by Chinese capital in the European context certainly speak to arguments, debates, and again, tensions surrounding these developments. We want to also look at the specific structuring of these projects. So, what kind of capital is involved in financing them? Is it private capital, state capital, perhaps a mix of both? Which parts of China these capital inflows originate? Obviously, to say something very obvious, it's a very big country. It's not particularly just one thing. So there's multiple different dynamics across Chinese territory, and then of course the kind of the local structures. What are the kind of political engagements with this? Is there scope for the things like kickbacks and corruption, practice of rent-seeking behaviour, and all these kind of aspects? So we want to go ahead and look at those things as well. And then again, that kind of speaks to the way that these investments interact with the national and local development policy. So if you have, for example, one project we want to look at is the upgrade to Manchester Airport in this country. And so what does that mean for Manchester City? What does it mean for the constituency in which it's in? How do politicians, local or national, kind of try to attract capital, or perhaps detract them? What does that mean for investment and then divestment? So there's lots of questions which we will seek to uncover. And then ultimately, in order to achieve this, we think it's critical really to kind of develop a new analytical framework around development and development studies broadly defined, in order to help kind of answer the questions contained within the aspects I just mentioned. Again, what we want to do is bring kind of development studies to Europe. Often, and this is a lot of Giles's thinking here, critical development theory is usually confined to the so-called global south. But importantly, China is sometimes labelled put in the global south, sometimes it's put in the global north. So it's not exactly clear where this country might fit. And then you have other kind of global areas. So, for example, the post-socialist European countries, which used to be called the Second World before 1989, 1991. These kind of countries are also not particularly easily indexed between these two binaries. So bringing the kind of the development studies and all that comes with it to the European context may help to kind of better understand what this means for development theory. Again, we have, Giles is particularly concerned with the methodological nationalism around development studies, which has been done so far. So one infrastructure project, for example, just to kind of keep it with the empirical aspects of Redefine, goes over to countries' territory. So this is the Belgrade to Budapest railway upgrade, which I'll talk about a little bit more shortly. So again, that obviously would not really, analysis of such a project would not really fit easily within these methodological nationalist understanding of development studies. And then moving away from the kind of Eurocentrism or Atlanticism, that's another important aspect here. So rather than just assuming that rich countries will kind of attract all this capital and then just stay rich and things like that, and this is somehow a kind of a good thing, we want to kind of challenge these assumptions as well. And then we want to also look at what this means for capitalist development, broadly defined, and then the theories that are connected to that. So, for example, of course, the varieties of capitalism debates, and then there's the variegated capitalism debates, and so on. And we want to address those as time goes on. Just to give you some data on that you see on the graphic on the right of this slide, the rise in inward capital flows from China in the second half of the 2000s really took off, and then that was as you can see, the peak was in 2016. Since then, it has dropped, and the data is not updated to take into account COVID. But this is also an important aspect of it as well. So, I mean, since the bid was accepted almost 3 years ago, we need to kind of now try to understand what is what might be the impact of divestment in these particular projects or in these particular countries. And the last 2 days, we've had a series of meetings trying to discuss that. But I mean, apart from that, the graphic kind of speaks for itself. There's these huge inflows of Chinese capital, and then that again tips into, as I mentioned in the previous slide, the geopolitical tensions. And just, you know, to give an example, kind of close to home, although this is not a project we are going to concern ourselves with, the Hinkley Point power station which is close to Bristol, which would be co-financed by French and Chinese consortium of companies, as I understand it, has been put under enormous pressure in the political realm from the United States at the end of the previous president's administration. So that kind of also speaks to reduction in Chinese inflows as well. Okay, so just to get right into the kind of the content of the project, we have 4 case studies, as Lorena mentioned at the beginning: the UK, Germany, Greece, and Hungary. Obviously, these countries are quite diverse, not just in size, population, history, geography, etc. But 3 of them are in the European Union. 1 of them is now not in the European Union. So that speaks to a lot of overlaps of institutions as well. And then within these project, we have developed 3 principal work streams. And so I will just read off some questions from them. So within the first work stream, which Giles has called driving, some example questions are: we want to understand how China's changing economy, regulatory arrangements and institutions are shaping firms and infrastructure investments in Europe. We also want to understand European countries' place in the global economy and how that's shaping the development of their infrastructure and how they attract investments. The second work stream, gathering, within this work stream, we want to understand how Chinese investors assemble large-scale investment projects in Europe, and then what forms of financing and contracting are required to assemble such projects. So again, going back to the previous slide, about 3 slides ago, this is talking about the local politics on the ground, whether that's a national or regional dimension of that. And then the third work stream, called linking, here we want to ask in what ways are Chinese investments delivering economic benefits to European countries. So is this really going down into the broader society around the project, or do these perhaps just create, say, for example, rentier opportunities for individual or institutional investors to, for example, buy up land around infrastructure projects in the anticipation that these will create windfalls in the future? Some recent work by Seth Schindler at Manchester has looked at that in the African context, as I understand it. And then also, how is China's growing presence in Europe contested politically across different scales? So, of course, this then speaks to debates and arguments within human geography and what they mean going forward. Okay, in terms of methodology, what we're going to do is draw on the critical theories from development studies, geography, sociology, and political economy, and we've tried to kind of represent this from the postdoctoral. Myself and my colleagues come from different backgrounds. As I said, we'll talk about that as the presentation goes on. And the objective of this is to develop a kind of scale-sensitive analytical framework. This is going to be a multi-case comparative process tracing approach of the 4 countries, and then within each of these 4 countries there are 2 infrastructure projects. So that's 8 infrastructure projects in total, of course. What we want to do is we're going to spend some significant period of time in the field in these 4 countries conducting semi-structured interviews and other techniques such as participant observation, and the people we want to talk to will be, for example, brokers, lobbyists, sitting politicians, former politicians, workers, local residents, trade unionists, financiers, and the like. What we also want to do is combine this with some quantitative data and investment, and to do that, we now have a membership with a data. How can I best describe that? Like basically a company called Prequin, and what they do is they collect up to the minute kind of data on investment flows, and this isn't just limited to Chinese capital, but this is a global. This is data collection on a global scale. It also contains information of key personnel in the project. So we use that to kind of harvest information and then hopefully present some good data as the project moves forward. This table shows you the time frame. So obviously this was created before COVID, so that has slightly, we're going to have to slightly adapt to that as time goes on. But unfortunately we are still missing one postdoctoral researcher, but hopefully he or she will join, as I mentioned, in the early new year. And then going down, the 4 case studies will be staggered. As you can see, and the benefit of this will be to kind of meet up in person with each other and kind of bounce ideas off each other and try to better understand and comprehend the data we've collected. And then this will hopefully be able to create a better presentation of our data as we then go on to kind of publish in the latter years of this particular time frame. Now, the 4 case studies are, as I mentioned, the UK, Greece, Germany, and Hungary. In the UK context, what we're going to be looking at is investment into real estate and transport infrastructure. In Hungary, this will be greenfield transport infrastructure investment. In the German case, this is a combination of mergers and acquisitions of high technology firms in energy and waste management. And then finally, in the Greek case, we're looking at the takeover existing transport infrastructure and a new real estate investment. So, for example, we're looking at there the port of Piraeus. Now, I will give you an example of an infrastructure project we will look at. So this is the much talked about Belgrade to Budapest railway upgrade. The way I understand it is one of the reasons this has been much talked about is kind of twofold. First of all, it's because of this kind of reified good Western capital versus bad Eastern capital kind of simplistic argument. So if you have Chinese capital financing these projects, that's somehow not good for Europe, which is again what we would like to address as the project goes on. And then the second kind of controversial dimension of this project is that this is happening in Hungary, at least half of it. And of course, the current government in Hungary, which has been there since 2010, has become a kind of bogeyman of the European Union and Western democracy in general. And so it's received a lot of media attention considering the size of the country, which is under 10 million. And then, of course, Serbia, which has also typically receives rather a bad press, is a non-EU member, of course. And so again, as I mentioned at the beginning, this creates this provides us a kind of interesting way to kind of understand development in Europe and what this means for institutions as time goes on. Specifically about the project, this was signed in 2015 between the Hungarian, Serbian political parties and also the Chinese Export-Import Bank. So this will be financed 85% of project value from a loan from this bank, and then the remainder of this capital will be funded. I'm talking now on the Hungarian side, will be funded by the Hungarian state, so the Hungarian taxpayer. The approximate total cost is 3.2 billion euro, just over half of which will be borne by the Hungarian entities. And because Hungary is an EU member, the European Commission and competition policy has so far rather kind of blocked the development of this project, whereas in Serbia, being a non-EU member, it's been able to go ahead and, as far as I understand it, it's rather close to finishing its section of this upgrade. The repayment timetable is the interest rate is relatively high. It's at 2.5% for a rate over 18 to 20 years. So this will be if repayments begin. I'm not quite sure of the latest news on when repayments might have begun, but of course this will go into the almost into the 2040s. And just incidentally, this coincides with an enormous Russian state bank loan to in the Hungarian context to upgrade the to extend Hungary's Seoul nuclear power plant, and the exposure on that investment project is much higher and will go on into the 2040s at a interest rate peaking at 4.5%. So, and as I said, all this will be borne by the Hungarian taxpayer, which creates quite a risky repayment timetable for the borrower. And so, again, this kind of ties into the kind of questions we would like to look at and help understand regards to what Chinese involvement in European infrastructure means for European development going forward. The rationale of this, ostensibly, is to lessen dependence on Western European firms. After the cessation of state socialism in Hungary in the 1990s, a series of principally German firms came into the country, and this was the case across the remainder of the Visegrad 4 countries, so Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia and Poland. And this is typically in the automobile sector, so Hungary is highly dependent on firms such as Daimler, Audi, Volkswagen, and also Japanese firms such as Suzuki. So that was the kind of rationale of developing this railway line, and then they would be able to receive Chinese manufactured goods, which would come up, as you can see from this larger map, from the state-owned, Chinese-owned port of Poorest in Greece. And so this, as you can see, the segment between Belgrade and Budapest would kind of join on, and then the idea was to then create, kind of develop Hungary as a logistics centre, essentially, for the onward dispersal of Chinese manufactured goods across post-socialist Europe and then into Western Europe. As I said at the beginning, this has become a kind of quite a controversial project, but nonetheless there are some advantages to this project which I've identified in my own work. First of all, it will influence railway development in the region. The Western Balkans and then into Hungary is, as I'm sure many of you know, highly underdeveloped vis-a-vis the western half of the continent for rather obvious reasons. And one aspect of this is a European Union policy called TENT is the acronym. And if you look at the map of European railways, most of them go from east to west rather than north to south. So The main north to south lines run from the UK to Spain. The second one is from Scandinavia to Italy, with a clear third from the Baltic to the Aegean as yet to be completed. So this will be part of this development. So this is also part of the reason why the European Union came round essentially to kind of agreeing for this development to go ahead. Secondly, there could be complementary economic activities emanating from this development. So, for example, Slovenia, Austria, and Hungary have signed a memorandum of understanding to develop a track to test autonomous vehicles, and the estimation is this could add quite under 0.05% of Hungarian GDP annually, but nonetheless this would create a small advantage to the local economies in the region. Third, this is a potential catalyst for European Union accession for some Western Balkan states that are yet to accede. So principally Serbia, of course, but also, say, for example, Montenegro and now renamed North Macedonia. And this is a kind of a long-term ambition of the Hungarian government to see this happen as well. And then finally, the anticipated construction of a distribution center for the aforementioned Chinese manufactured goods would be located perhaps quite obviously close to the track. So once these goods arrive across the maritime Silk Road, they go up through up the line from Poorest. They are then shifted into this center, and then, as I said before, distributed across not just to the Balkans or the eastern half of the continent, but to the west as well. That's the kind of ambition. As you can see on this map, this kind of, as I just mentioned, this kind of complements the maritime Silk Road, so-called, and then this could add, this would perhaps compete or rival the land railway going across China and then Kazakhstan and Russia and then into Europe that way. This particular deal is very complicated and multidimensional, as is probably apparent from what I've been saying so far. I would argue that this investment is quite idiosyncratic case of Chinese presence in Hungary. There has been quite a few examples of Chinese investment in Hungary, but this is by far the largest since 2010 at least. There was one which is a bit smaller, but a large one in a chemical facility in eastern Hungary just before Fidesz were elected again in 2010. And this means also the kind of results of this upgrade are that Sino-Hungarian relations have become more important since 2010. And you will see this is part of the reason why, at least as I see it, the current Hungarian government get so much attention in the Western media. It's not just that they are so-called illiberal or perhaps anti-EU, but they are seen to be, at least in the Western media, relatively pro-Chinese. And this seems to create a lot of controversy. But even though we know quite a lot about this particular investment, where there is quite clearly most of the content we don't know, and we also do not know what this means for Hungary or the surrounding countries or Europe or the transport sector or the knock-on effect to local politics, etc., which is kind of goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. So there's still a lot to talk about, and as I mentioned, this is just one of the infrastructure projects we will look at, of a total of 8. So now I will turn to the next section will be on our post-doctoral researches, and I will give the floor briefly to Susan, who will introduce herself.
Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you very much again for everyone coming. Just a very quick self-introduction about myself. I recently have completed my PhD at University of Cambridge, Urban and Migrant Studies. It's more about urbanization in today's China, like how urban public space, urban neighborhoods, and a lot of infrastructure facilities could help some migrants to better relocate or integrate in the cities in China. Also, at the same time, I would like to do some research on people and place relationships, and also I have very rich several years infrastructure practice and research experience, mainly in the infrastructure about healthcare, transports, or some recreational facilities. At the same time, these years I have contributed to public engagements and have some collaborated projects with different NGOs or the local governments, mainly in China and the UK. For example, some projects about the social mobility in Cambridgeshire and young refugees, migrants relocation. I have also developed some digital tools to help different cities or towns, not only in the developing world, but also some other countries for their diagnosis of urban planning, urban governance, and sustainable mobilities process and problems in their urbanization process. And also in accordance with our REDEFINE project, I also have some experience in how to use commercialization ideas or investments concepts to help the development of some medical or educational infrastructure in different countries. Next slide, please. Thank you, Sam. And for these different projects and my own experience, I have mastered some skills in terms of doing, for example, structure or semi-structure interviews, policy speak, social media analysis, and observation, mainly in the fields of ethnographical research methodologies. So I could use these skills to contribute to our research. For example, I may more focus on how the migration and labor relations relevant laws involved in the infrastructure investment from China to the UK and other EU countries. And I personally think our project is very interesting because China, although it's a developing country, it can also make some contribution to the investment in some developed countries in the UK or some other countries in the EU. So I really expect some new interesting and stimulating results and fundings from our projects. And for this, I also I'm interested in how the infrastructure investments may contribute to China and even beyond, like how China and other countries' relationships may be involved in this whole project, and how we could take advantage of what we could get in our REDEFINE project to the global development. And also, I believe our project may also enlight some political implications in the UK, China, EU countries, but also like the international relationships in a broader scope. Thank you very much. And because of the time limitation, just very short introduction. So if you have any questions, we can address them in our Q&A later. I would like to hand it over back to my colleague, Sam. Sam, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And as I mentioned, and also Lorena mentioned, our colleague Florian Schaefer unfortunately could not be here with us today as he is ill. So get well soon, Florian. And in the meantime, I will give you a brief overview of his profile. So he's a political economist who's previously worked at the Universities of Sussex, SOAS and LSE. I believe he got his PhD in SOAS, but I hope he forgives me if I got that wrong. Giles is nodding, so that's a good sign. His research interests cover the overseas operations of Chinese firms, global production networks, industrial policy and employment relations. He's used quantitative, qualitative methods and draws on historical political economy, development studies, economics and economic geography, and his work's been published in journals such as World Development, Campbell's Systematic Reviews, and he's also published twice in Oxford Handbooks. He's particularly excited about bringing insights from critical development theory into high income settings in the European Union. And I'll just add one thing, he's also bilingual English and German, so that's very helpful for our project. And as you can see, complements Susan's work very nicely for our project as well. And then finally, just about myself, I got my PhD from the University of Bristol in global political economy a couple of years ago. My thesis was on the development of the Hungarian political economy since 2010, hence why I just talked about the Belgrade to Budapest railway upgrade, and this will be hopefully coming out in book format, published by Routledge next year. Before coming to Open, I had a few visiting research positions at the Central European University, which used to be in Budapest but has been kicked out and is now in Vienna. I'm also a member of the China in Europe Research Network, which colleagues of mine at Bristol and the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam began in 2017. This is funded by COST. And if you're not familiar with it, I would encourage you, all audience members, to have a look at that, because they have some excellent initiatives within that research network, which is ongoing and will be until 2023. So there's still a couple of years left to run on that. What drew me to this particular position is my long-standing interest in Chinese outward investment. This is not particularly limited to Europe, but in a general global sphere. Post-socialist European development, particularly a liberal capitalist development, which is something I'm very interested in researching on more. And then finally, of course, the political economy of infrastructure projects. Thank you very much for your attention. Please do keep in touch with this project. We will be working together for another 3 years, so we're looking forward to engaging with you all. And I will now hand over back to Lorena for the questions and answers. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sam. I think this has been very informative, and not only internally, because sometimes you wonder who does what and what people are working on, but also externally, because if I remember correctly, this is the first year of the project. So this date kind of fits perfectly with marking the first year of the project. I don't know if Giles wants to add something, and thanks for joining us, Giles. You're on mute.
Yeah, apologies. I was running a research training thing for RES, which has been in the diary for like 5 years, as far as I can remember. Because I don't know what was said, I don't know, sort of go, oh yeah, yada, 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 and find out I've just repeated whatever my very good colleagues have just said. Okay. So they're the stars of the show, as far as I'm concerned. So I'm happy to answer questions that people have of me, but if I try and second guess what they may or may not have said, we could just be going
Yeah. I mean, we basically ran through the overview of the project, and also we introduced Sam introduced the team, and I think it's been like also very interesting insight about like what has been like the geographical coverage of the project, but also the thematic and methodological approach. So I will just open the floor for questions or clarification.
I mean, did they? I'm sure they did, but was there any sense of why I got interested in why we got interested in it in
No,
the first
you
place.
can tell us a bit about why is your understand. We touched upon, and this is one of the questions that might arise now with this big debate about decolonization and this idea of development in high-income countries. So maybe you can like spend some couple of minutes to tell us more motivation of the project.
So yeah, I mean, thanks Lorena, thanks to Susan, Sam and Florin. So yeah, I'd been working for a number of years on sort of Chinese investment into Africa, so mainly West Africa, where there'd been, and so I'm not an infrastructure person by background. It was just that because a lot of what the Chinese had been doing in Africa were infrastructure projects, you therefore have to understand that. So for example, Frankton's PhD was all on wind power in Ethiopia, you know, big bits of infrastructure. But we'd also done some work with Ben Lampert, and when Ben came to the OU, was working on sort of more small-scale business migrants into to Africa. And then it was actually, as all the best research is, it was an article in The Guardian about how Sheffield City Council were accepting this big investment from a Chinese investor on a regeneration project. So they were going to do up a bit of the city centre and build some stuff. And it was the first time that, you know, local government was taking this kind of investment. It all fell through, paradoxically, but then the more we started to dig into this, it realized that actually, you know, if you look at, there was a big project that was going on in Mersey, on the whole Mersey estuary with the Peel Group. Again, the Chinese backers were bringing billions of investment, but that fell through. And then we began to see that there was this emergence of, you know, buying into the 5G networks through Huawei. There was building into nuclear power station, where again now that's fallen through. So there's big issues about the geopolitics, and I think what the US are doing in terms of putting pressure on the British government to get the Chinese out of various bits of critical infrastructure. And then also you see that across Europe, and you know, I'm sure they've touched on the kind of the different methodologies. So there was the big question then is, well, okay, I've been doing development studies in Africa on China. China is now no longer a developing country. It frames its engagement as being about South-South cooperation, which covers a multitude of sins. It kind of, you know, it gives a kind of ethical parity that we're all in it together, brothers and sisters, and we're all being colonized by those nasty, you know, Western European northern countries. But actually, China can, you know, obviously plays a big power game when it needs to. So this discourse of South-South development, I think, was concealing a lot of power relations which were not necessarily in the interest of some African countries and actors. But then what happens then when you have, in the context of where we first got interested in, Brexit was happening, the British government had cut its investment in infrastructure. You had a devolution agenda, which was saying, Sheffield City Council, you need to get infrastructure built, and we're not going to give you the money for it, so go off and find it on the international markets. So they go to China. So that, you know, there's this thing called the Northern Pitch Book, which you can get on the government websites. This is a pitch book of, you go to, here's some big projects to pitch for money for. And at that time, the Northern Powerhouse, which was, you know, that still kind of there with the Build Back Better bollocks agenda that's going on at the moment, you know, this idea that you can, you know, create a kind of regional infrastructure investment hub around Leeds, Sheffield, Manchester and Liverpool. So interesting times, and getting into international investment in. So then what does that mean when you're now looking at a nominally developing country like China is coming to Europe, and parts of Europe which are arguably less central to global modernity and global development than they were. And that was when these debates in you know, the kind of Rory Horner type debates about, you know, global development, and do we need to change the optic of where we look at the processes of development taking place. And it's not simply a north-south thing where development occurs in the south, which, I mean, people at the OU and others have been arguing for a long time, but actually when we turn the development lens back onto Europe, what is it, what is the European project? Can we take a post-colonial lens to deconstructing what we mean by Europe? Because Europe's not you know, a singular entity. You know, there's a horrible discourse which we saw in the Greek crisis, and Demos, who some of you know, wrote an excellent PhD on the crisis within the crisis. Greece is treated as a failed state. You get the Troika coming in and giving them structural adjustment. You know, we've done that in Africa for 20 years with very mixed results. You then have China as a mostly developing country now, and lending millions in critical infrastructure. So it really said, what's the optic for global development now that all these kind of big geopolitical and geoeconomic changes are taking place? So, but then you kind of flip the whole thing and say, well, okay, but to get at that, yes, you can either deal with this at a very grand geopolitical scale, but actually going on a methodology going through on a project by project basis and sort of thinking about process tracing these decisions. We're trying to get at that big picture through these kind of projects, which I'm sure Sam and Susan have covered. So I'll stop.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, it gives you, I mean, it actually gives a sense of what this comes from, and it makes total sense. And also about the scales, no, how this local and national and global kind of dialectically interact. So I now open the floor for questions. I can see one question from Antonis Kiparisis, which, I mean, if I remember correctly, is a PhD student in the business school and is from Greece, so it might be interesting question. And if people wants to either put their question in the chat box, but if they don't want to appear, please put your question in the chat box or raise your hands, we'll gather. Yes. So, Antonis, do you want to unmute? Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi,
Yes.
Adonis. So, yes, how do you guess that because of my origin, I am more interested to this? So, two practical questions. I am an economist, and I would like to hear, you mentioned, I have seen some slight, let's say, economic data from the case of Hungary. For example, I saw a loan of 2.5% of interest rate, which is, I can describe it as okay for this low interest rate up to today, let's say, issue. So I would like to hear, for example, which is the internal rate of return of these companies. The reason why I'm asking this is I would like to compare why the local capitals, especially in the UK and in the German case, which is, let's say, they have got a mature internal market, why the capitals there are do not want to invest in these areas. This is the first question, and the second question, the first speaker said initially something about, if I remember correctly, the delivery of economic benefits to European countries. Could you please explain to me what exactly do you mean by this? Because a country is not a neutral issue. Because I am from Greece, what I can see is that Costco in Piraeus is a hardcore capitalist Chinese company which does not accept unions. 2 weeks ago, we had a huge strike in Piraeus. A worker was dead because there was no measure of health and safety in this company. So the wages are extremely low. So I would like to hear this. Can we speak? I see also Frankton with us, so he can tell us a lot because he is the guy who is let's say, behind this all these discussions. So hi, Frank. So I would like to hear this. I would like to hear these two issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Antonis. Is it okay for you guys if I gather like a couple of other questions and then like 2-3 questions and then you, yeah? Okay, so we have two questions in the chat box. One is really practical from Enoch Gabriel Mondalman. I guess he's external to the OU, and he's asking whether Redefine will recruit new PhD students. And then Susan Dines that is asking, do you think that is a concerted intention to extend control by the Chinese government? And then I can see Dave Wild, who has a question. And yeah, if you want, unmute yourself, Dave.
Okay, hi.
Hi.
It's actually it's great to have a discussion about not only a really good, important project, but early. Normally, we only find out about projects when they're kind of rolling. So that's really good. So excellent practice. My question's a bit different. It's about the nature of innovation, I think, because it felt sometimes like infrastructure was like an invariable, like a fixed variable, a thing that is put in place and is invested in, and there's a load of politics because these are really big investments. But I was thinking about investment, whether a project as big as this could say something more about the nature of investment itself, the deconstruction of the infrastructure itself. For example, is the infrastructure 20th century infrastructure being transferred into bits of Europe, say, heavy, polluting, not very green, with knowledge which is relatively lower key, that kind of thing? Or is this an opportunity to change the knowledge flows and to have a more dynamic knowledge flow, Germany, China, for example, and actually to build innovation rather than just transfer it, that kind of thing. So it's really about whether this project can say something important about the nature of infrastructure.
Thank you, David. Very interesting question. So, Giles, do you want to reply to those, and then we will open another round of questions?
I can. I mean, also there was an injunction there to sort of involve Frankton as well in the response, which is It'd be nice to have more of a conversation about this rather than just you know, the PI responding. I mean,
no, but it's also.
I'll have a quick go in terms of the first question. We have recruited PhDs, but Henok, do get in touch with me individually, because we haven't got more money on at the moment. We are looking for good projects to get funding for. So if you've got a good idea, then please get in touch. So my email should be on there somewhere. I think on the nature of Dave's question, I think it's an interesting one. So I think what's interesting about all of this, Dave, is partly about where the investment is going. So if you look at, say, the work that Filippo's been doing in politics on CPEC in Pakistan, there's been a number of big coal-fired power stations being built in Pakistan. So there's this kind of tension between what China says it's doing in terms of its green credentials and its overseas lending, offshoring effectively very polluting industries. So I think there's those issues. But then I think the kind of regulatory environment into which those investments are taking place is also something we want to look at. So if your environmental standards and your enforcement of those is higher, or even your labor standards or whatever, then one of the questions is, what are the different dynamics you get? You know, so the big debate in Africa is that the Chinese bring all their own labor with them. That was crap anyway, but there was partly a reason to do that when you had labor markets that weren't functioning as well post-conflict in Angola, say. So trying to unpick it at the more finer grain level is one way to do that. I think when you look at, say, the investment in Germany, what's interesting there is I think the Chinese are trying to leapfrog their own green innovation by buying into merger and acquisitions with German tech companies, and then re-exporting that knowledge back into China to speed up their innovation. So, and that's one of the big tensions now in the EU China investment debates is are the Chinese now just coming to sort of steal intellectual property and use it for non-European benefit, basically. So I think it's a good question, and I think it is one we need to sort of really unpick. I think in terms of some of those kind of more mature, you know, I think there is some of the kind of road and port stuff. It's fairly standard infrastructure technology, but I think either side of that there is very polluting ungreen technology and interesting ways in which green technology is being used. But I'll let Sam and Susan and Frankton and others speak.
Yeah, thanks, Giles. Regarding the question about the kind of forgive me if I didn't understand this question correctly, but I think it was around, so specifically these Hungarian investment, which I mentioned earlier, and the rate of interest rate on the loan, and it was mentioned that this is an okay rate. Yet that is true by all intents and purposes, but you have to remember that this is for a long period of time, so between 18 and 20 years, as I mentioned. It also combines with this enormous interest rate loan, which is 4.5%, from this Russian state-owned bank for the nuclear power plant extension, which is much more expensive as well. So that's a cost of 10 billion euro loan. So combine that with the 1.68 billion of the Chinese loan, that's a total of about 8 or 9% of Hungarian GDP. Which makes it extremely risky, and also Hungary has a history of being a large-scale debtor country, and this began already in the 80s, before the end of state socialism. So it speaks to the kind of debates around Hungarian development specifically, what this means for external debt, how that will be repaid, and also then collateral asset acquisition, etc. I completely understand about the benefits or lack thereof of such investments, about the Poorest example and the worker that died recently. I'm afraid I just simply wasn't aware of that. However, I want to make it clear that, you know, of all of these infrastructure investments, and the one which I mentioned earlier, again, this railway, there will always be identifiable advantages from these projects. So it's not simply a case that this is all good or all bad in that kind of very black and white kind of way of understanding. So there will always be advantages to them. I can see in the chat now. I asked to.
Any advantage for the people, please? Any advantage for the poorer strata of these countries? Thank you.
Oh, I see.
I think there's also the part of the question, Sam, was about the comparative. So why was it that kind of domestic capital wasn't investing in these projects in the way that Chinese capital was? So was there something about the rate of return that made it less appealing? And if it was less appealing, why are the Chinese investing, I think might be the question.
Sure.
But
Thank you. Yeah, I remember now. Thanks for reminding me, Giles. So in this specific deal, there's simply so the railway line already exists. I don't know if anyone's had the pleasure of traveling on it, but it takes 8.5 hours to travel 400 kilometers, which is obviously very slow. So upgrading this will turn it to 3.5 hours. But the problem is, one of the problems is there's no traffic on this line, human traffic, I mean. So the largest town across this line between the two capitals is something like 27,000 population. So basically, nobody really uses this line. So there wasn't much incentive for local investors to get involved with this because they didn't see any prospect of profit-making opportunity coming from it. So as I mentioned, one of the rationales for this from the Hungarian side for agreeing to this project was to reduce dependency on Western firms. Whether or not that will materialize is another question, but that was their rationale. And then from the Chinese side, it was to create this kind of route, transport corridor for the onward dispersal of their goods. Regarding, sorry, I'll just quickly finish this answer. So regarding the poorest strata of society, it's very hard to say. So in the Hungarian case, of course, you have this government which has been in power for over 11 years. There's high levels of corruption and the creation of fiefs, F-I-E-F-S, across the country, which have basically accumulated and subsumed domestic business for the benefit of regime reproduction. And now this particular government is in a highly strong position because of that, because in their previous position in government between 1998 and 2002, what they did not do was to get kind of domestic capital on side, so to speak, but they have not made the same mistake twice. And so pouring into like the lower strata of society, I would not say that there's much of that is going to happen from this particular project. But the other 7 projects which are involved in Redefine, we're yet to find that out.
And so just a quick one. I mean, so Antonis, part of the reason that the Sheffield case was interesting because it was badged as regeneration, but when you actually dug into it, it was all about high-end refurbishment for hotels and retail and stuff. And so I think one of the things that and there's been a useful paper by somebody at Cambridge, I think, recently looking across 3 big port developments: Costco, Colombo, sorry, in Sri Lanka, and London. And in all cases, the argument is that this is largely, there may be some port redevelopment, but aside of it is a whole kind of harbour, yachts, cinemas. It's a very high-end, exclusive form of urban regeneration that the Chinese are buying into, I think. So I think I tend to, let's park it in a sense of, I don't want to preempt, but it does seem to be that this isn't, in a way that some of the African-based infrastructure, I think you could argue, is bringing more social benefits, not necessarily jobs in the construction phases, but down the line. Some of this isn't. I think it is more sort of, and I think that's where you do get those differences. In the UK, the critical infrastructure the China's been kicked out of, both nuclear and 5G. They're left with these kind of fairly swanky office developments. In terms of, I think, some of the profit question, in both the Manchester case we're looking at and the London case, these are essentially almost like Chinese business parks that are being created for the inward movement of other Chinese businesses. So that's why Huawei was doing some of the tech infrastructure in them as well. So I think there's, I think there'll be in and of themselves a particular rate of return for the office regeneration, but I think some of the other the onward development is that these will become almost like not special economic zones for Chinese businesses, but there's something about industrial clustering around those, which I think is something to think about as an onward outcome, really.
Thank you, Giles. I don't know if Susan wants to add something.
Oh, hello.
Hi.
I'm very, very new at all of this, and I'm just really interested in kind of trying to unpick whether there's evidence that the investment is piecemeal, as it were, from different companies and different sources, or whether it's possibly a sort of more connected initiative, if that makes sense.
Sorry, I'm laughing because this is the question we've been discussing for about the last 2 weeks within the project. So it's a very good question.
Okay, good.
Does anybody want to answer it?
Yeah, our Susan or someone.
Okay, I can just a very quick comment. Thank you so much. And I think it is just a case by case thing, because probably for example, for our project, we will have 4 case studies and we will focus on different sectors. I think it will depend on what kind of specific surveys or what kind of specific things included in what we hope to learn. And it's really the situation that some things could be combined and interact with each other, but without more data or exploration of this research, probably it might be a bit hard now to.
I think what we're trying to sort of think through is, if there's been a dominant discourse, and you see it in international relations theory, and you see it in kind of more bullish kind of political statements of I mean, who else does bullish political statements as well as Donald Trump? But there's an idea that there's some kind of strategic coordination on the Chinese side, that there's something called China Inc., and that there's that the Communist Party have some kind of puppet strings that they control all this stuff. And really what we're trying to explore is essentially the multi-scalar, multi-actor ways in which these processes play out, but trying to capture the tension between, is it all uncoordinated and just, firm A going off and doing its thing and firm B doing their thing? The Belt and Road Initiative is a discourse which tries to give it coherence, and it's a sort of ex post rationalization of a load of stuff that was going on, and you give it a grand strategy, but it's not a grand strategy. At the same time, it would be naive, I think, to say that China does not have aspirations, geopolitically. I don't think it's like it wants to control the world, and there's interesting debates about how far we're in a multipolar world, what's the relationship between the state and private capital and state capitalisms. One argument which seems quite persuasive is that Chinese businesses and say US businesses are so mutually interconnected now. There's a big piece in the Le Monde Diplomatique this month. Trump is saying one thing and Biden even about the kind of threat from China, but actually US corporations are investing heavily into China in Disneylands and this, that, and the other. So there's already that interpenetration of capitals that's you're going to make, building it up as some kind of civilizational war between the liberal West and the illiberal East is bullshit, really. But at the same time, then we're trying to do in the project then say, well, okay, if there is something of a geopolitical movement, let's say not coordinated strategy, that is happening, we need to understand that. We don't want to be naive and say, oh, China's just lovely and it's all great, or the US is lovely and it's all great. But at the same time, trying to understand, one of the big things is the devolution within China to provincial level state-owned enterprises. So there's a big debate now about state capitalism, very interesting, but still tend to take a quite nationally centered view of state capitalism. It's sovereign wealth funds from Qatar, it's China's big SAFE, which is a big sovereign wealth fund investing in here, there and everywhere. What happens when you have the Hunan province, set of SOEs and private capital working in bits of Africa and having a network? It's much more complicated than that. So we're trying to unpick that multi-layered, multi-actor kind of engagement. So your question is very good because I can't answer it, but there's somewhere in between. It's kind of, I don't think there's some grand strategy, but at the same time, it's not just a free-for-all.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, and it's interesting that the case in Greece, that wherever in that particular case, obviously we know all about the human rights abuses, but not allowing there to be unions and this sort of thing does seem to be a really scary thing, that they're imposing their own lack of respect for human rights as they potentially expand, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think we'll see. I'm not going to defend or slate these, but I think for example in Ghana we saw something similar where the Chinese said we're not going to allow any unions. The Ghanaian government said, but unions are enshrined in our law, so we need a union. They said, okay, we'll put a union in, and they did. So I think there's something about the political agency on the recipient side that how much are those countries have got the legal frameworks and willing to sort of enforce them to do that, or is it a kind of race to the bottom of okay, if we want this investment, we'll bend over any which way you want us to, and we'll give you what you want. And I think so. Yeah, I think and Thomas's point, these are capitalist enterprises. Whether they're Chinese or otherwise, I'm not going to suddenly say that I think there's bad Chinese capitalism and good American capitalism, or vice versa.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Super.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. So I'm wondering if there are any other questions from the audience. Otherwise, I will just follow up on the regulatory environment and the condition, and I like the game, like the words play that Dave used about deconstruct infrastructures, and it's about whether it's more about the infrastructure per se, or rather the infrastructure environment of the project, considering that such a big financial project entails a lot of financial, social, economic kind of dimensions. And my question is, so there are two parts. One is about this bank, like that good governance story. So when I was working in Uzbekistan, and the big funder was the European Union at the time and the US before China came in, and there was the big message and buzzwords of the European Union funding were about good governance. So whether and we know that one of the big differences is that Chinese do not operate by being very needy about the need for good governance issues. But my question is paradoxically maybe one of the incentive of the catalyst for Chinese to come to Europe as being part of, be investing in a place that is kind of in place with all the regulatory system. And another question is about, this speaks to the way of, like decolonization, in the sense that it's a kind of a leapfrogging way of using, like a very European solid understanding of, regulations are, and navigate within those limits and boundaries. I don't know if being clear, but I think one of the contributions of this project is about the re-understanding, a conceptualization and empirical understanding of what decolonization can be. And could be that, one of the tension there is about the regulations and the way Chinese use, very, good, like very advanced or well-developed, regulatory and anti-corruption and everything, like rule of law kind of, teams. And then, yeah, I mean, Anthony's made a comment about Greek government and Costco.
Yeah, thanks, Antonis. We may come and buy you a coffee and pick your brains on this one.
Milton Keynes, yeah. So yeah, if you have like any thoughts about this for our last 5 minutes, and then we wrap up.
I mean, in terms of your first question, Lorena, I mean, so one argument I think I've seen is that essentially, these Chinese companies, when the going out policy was launched, Africa was seen as being the frontier because you could then test your foot in the water of being an international company in an environment where the stakes weren't so high, rather than kind of moving straight into kind of to Europe. And then I've seen a similar argument. There's almost like a hierarchy there. Then you move into Eastern Europe because that's kind of got a slightly Wild West regulatory environment, and it's a good way to get your, touch base with European regulatory environments, and then you can move into Europe proper kind of thing. So there's this kind of, I mean, I don't empirically know whether any of that's true. We need to sort of, I think one of the things I wanted to do is talk to some of these executives about the kind of the kind of the business decisions they've made and the risks, the risk analysis they make for these various types of investment. So I think one argument then is that they've kind of worked their way up to working in much more highly regulated business environments. And interestingly, our Chinese colleague who's visited the REDEFINE project as part of the churn cost exchange program, that's what he's really been looking at is on the Chinese side, looking at the Chinese literature, which is very much about, the European literature is very much the Chinese came and got lots of bargains across Europe at the time of the Eurozone crisis. So they bought all these state-owned enterprises that the Troika were telling, so these were bargains. So there's this argument that we see in Africa that the Chinese don't have a strategy. They just buy stuff because they've got loads of money. And it's the Chinese dragon coming to kind of, so there's that kind of discourse. Then you have the Chinese literature, as far as you can gather, saying, God, it's really hard to do business in Europe. And it's talking about the regulatory environments and the investment codes and the investment screening processes. And, so I think actually there may be some truth that some of these businesses have taken so you might go for a loss leader, you might invest in an African project or whatever, because you are trying to cut your teeth and learn that stuff. I think there's also an argument I've seen, which we need to sort of explore, that, when it comes to these investment projects and big infrastructure projects, there is a kind of gold, if you can invest in London, then you've kind of, you are seen as a sovereign wealth fund or whatever, you're seen as a kind of big player. If you can invest in kind of, and I don't mean this in the way that it sounds, but if you invest in Malawi, hey ho, so what kind of thing. But if you can get into a big prestige project in the heart of London or New York or wherever it might be, that there's something about arriving as your status as a global player. So I think there's a whole set of things that we need to explore.
Okay, thank you. So I guess we are happy to wrap up. Just Susan asked if you can recommend an introduction read about this, please. What would this, like the topic, or Susan, or a particular debate we are?
Really sort of just yes, sorry. You have. No, you have. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Oh, you replied.
Super.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Great. So I think if there are no other questions, we are happy to conclude, because there will be another meeting up soon. But for those who have missed it, the event has been recorded. So thank you very much. I hope there will be someone is as a
lawnmower.
And I mean, please do check the website. I'm gonna put it in the chat box. The link to the page, so you might want to get in contact with Giles, Sam, Susan, and Florian for any other question you might have. So we just thank you very much. Please do not forget to follow us on our Twitter account to get to get updated about the next seminars and activities as intdev_OU. And our next seminar will be on a topic that is strictly related to this, because we'll have Elia Salami with a seminar on called The Spectre of Capitalism. He's working on a new book with Adam Dixon, and he's like really focusing through another ERC project on this debate. So please come. And it will be on the 15th of December. So this event has been moved because he's going to be on fieldwork the previous week, but you will get an update on your calendar event. So it will be same time, 15th of December. So thank you very much, Sam, Giles, and Susan, and hope Florian will recover soon. And looking forward to the next year's seminar, so you will get some preliminary data results.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy your rest of the day.
Thank you.
And for some of you, see you at the school events. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Giles. Thanks. Bye.